Thank you for listening and supporting the Daily Memphian. Sign up for one of our many free newsletters and breaking news alerts at dailymemphian.com/email to receive the latest local news stories impacting our community. Our weekly newsletters cover everything from sports to arts and culture, business, food, and more, along with daily updates of all the news we publish each day. Sign up or manage your email preferences at dailymemphian.com/email.
Hi, this is Sam Hardiman with the Daily Memphian, and welcome to On the Record, a podcast. Today I'm joined by Cole Perry of Perry Strategies. Cole, thanks for being here.
Yeah, of course. It's good to be here.
And so could you explain what exactly you do to people?
Sure. So I wear a lot of different hats, but first I'll tell you what Perry Strategies does, and then I'll tell you what I do specifically. So Perry Strategies is a full-service political strategy firm. We provide campaign management, fundraising, voter targeting, and geographic and data analysis. So that last part is me. And so I, like I said, wear a lot of different hats. I started off working in civil engineering. That's what I got my bachelor's in at George Washington University. Studied transportation. And then I went on to grad school for urban planning and real estate development, 2 different degrees from Columbia University. And so I work full-time as a senior market analyst for a large commercial real estate data company, but the rest of the time I do this stuff. And so I'm sure you know from my Twitter account, I make a lot of maps in my free time, but also for Perry Strategies for campaign purposes.
Cole, where can people follow you on Twitter, since you mentioned your excellent Twitter account?
Sure. So it's at Cole Perry TN. So ColePerryTN.
And so why do you like data?
I view the world spatially, and I think that one of the mediums that's really come about in the last couple of years that people are starting to understand better are maps. I think there's a lot of public data out there that people don't know how to use, don't know how to display. And so I've just been drawn to sort of the, chart, graph, and map medium that allows people to access this information. It's all out there. It might be in different kinds of lists like voter rolls or election results. But if you don't know how to view this graphically or in a chart, it's hard to understand. And so I'm kind of obsessed with making that accessible, either to candidates or campaigns, or just to myself or to people on my Twitter account that might like it. So
what inspired you? Obviously your mother is the other piece of Perry Strategies.
Right.
But what got you into data? Like, when was that, sort of eureka moment as a kid? I remember learning to play hockey. I ran around with pots and pans on my head.
So I don't know if I had a eureka moment as a kid. I think where it really started for me was in undergrad. So the transportation concentration of civil engineering is very data heavy. It's a lot of traffic analysis. And I just sort of became obsessed with the R programming language and how to analyze average annual daily traffic, and statistical models that we had to work on a lot there. So that's what really clicked for me. But I've always kind of had the politics bug. I'm sure that it came from my mother, but I sort of really only knew of a couple of people that understood political mapping. And so I just did after that, did a deep dive on how could I integrate these 2 interests? How could I do geographic information systems programming and make it accessible or relatable for politics? And so that was kind of, 7-8 years ago, I think, at this point.
And so the reason I wanted to have you on the podcast, because people are surely wondering, why is this map making man here? He seems interesting. But we met in 2019,
right?
When I was at the Commercial Appeal at the time, and I was covering Mayor Jim Strickland's reelection campaign,
right?
And I believe we met in Whitehaven.
We did. We were knocking doors in Whitehaven,
and I kind of tagged along for the day, and I saw.
Right, I was the mayor's driver that day. So
right, and he was asking you questions, I think, on the literal placement of signs along Shelby Drive, if I recall.
So, we like to, my mom has this rule of thumb that you need somebody's name in front of you 13 times to remember it. And so I sort of use that as the benchmark for where we should put signs in very distinct corners so that we can maximize traffic, seeing those on your way to work.
Right. And so you and your mother worked on both Strickland campaigns, right?
That's right.
And that's 15 and 2019 for those listening here at home. And so having been a part of two successful mayoral campaigns, what makes a successful mayoral campaign, and what's going to take to be successful this year in 2023?
So, I think the theme for both of those campaigns was pretty simple, and it was getting city government back to the basics. That was something that Mayor Strickland was obsessed with at the time, as a councilman. And so, it's very simple stuff like mowing the grass, fixing potholes, making sure your trash gets picked up. And when people don't see that stuff is happening, then they obviously lose faith in the city to tackle the big stuff like crime. And so that was sort of the overarching theme behind those two campaigns, was really getting back to the simple stuff that people had lost faith in the city to be able to do. My mom likes to say that running for office and being an elected official are two completely different things. I think the campaigning is, being a retail politician, introducing yourself to voters, vastly different job than basically being the CEO of an 8,000 person organization and growing that. And so I think in order to be successful this time, you have to do two things. You can make the case all day long that you're going to be a great mayor. That's fine. But if you're not interesting, you can't convey that message to voters, you don't know how to target them, or you don't know where they are, you're never going to get to the highest office. Plenty of people that are great, would make great mayors, will never achieve it because they're not great retail politicians. So I think those two components are intertwined and inseparable.
Retail politics almost seems anachronistic in today's day and age, right? Because we live in this digital world. I write for a digital news outlet.
Exactly.
Right? So what about Memphis should readers and listeners, I guess, in this case, understand? What about these sort of both the demographics, but the makeup of the people? How do they want to be reached, and what's a bad way to reach them?
Right. It's interesting. I was thinking about it, and the Daily Memphian didn't exist during the first campaign, and so that's one thing that was different between the two. But something that's different about Memphis in general is that a lot of politics is informal. People, the electorate skews much older. It's much more diverse, and people still get their media through television. I think social media, it gets kind of all the hype and the buzz, and that's all good. And so is electronic media. But Memphis is kind of behind the curve, whether for good or bad, in terms of other large city electorates. A lot of people still get their news by word of mouth, even. They're not paying attention to the stuff that happens online. They're, watching Channel 3 or Channel 5. And that's what, how they learn about some of these candidates.
And so how important is earned media on those two channels? And then how much do you have to be on the airwaves to be as serious in terms of advertisements, to be serious come, June, July, August?
Yeah. I was thinking about this before, and the next disclosures will essentially cover all the way through June 30th. And I think that's going to tell you a lot about the slate of candidates. If you don't have, let's say, at least $250,000 in the bank, you're not going to be able to get on the airwaves at all come July 1. And in the home stretch of the campaign, that's going to be sort of detrimental. I think that there are a few candidates that already have sort of universal name recognition, but buying it is expensive. This is a large media market that covers multiple states. So you're going to be paying for airtime on some big stations and radio. There's a lot of different radio stations as well to cover ground for. But very simply, the cost of a stamp is up significantly from what it was in 2015 or 19. I think it's 63 cents. So sending direct mail, which is the really only proven way to get to 100% of voters because their addresses from voter rolls, That's become a lot more expensive these days, and targeting them with the specific message requires a lot of testing, and I think it's just become a lot more expensive, and buying name recognition for a race like this in 2023 is going to be pretty tough without money.
You mentioned name recognition. You mentioned there are a few candidates that have pretty universal name ID.
Right.
And then there are those that need to buy it. Who has pretty universal name ID? Willie Harrington? Who else?
Right. Floyd Bonner, I think, would as well, as the incumbent sheriff. And there are a couple others who have held elected office before, Van Turner, Karen Camper. And those are some of the candidates that I think would have more regional name recognition than citywide. Van Turner has also had sort of a national profile in the last couple of months, and I think that might benefit him. But how much that translates to name recognition on the local level, I'm not sure. But I think those few candidates certainly do.
And so who needs to buy some name ID?
I think Paul Young will need to buy some name ID. And I think really the rest of them, a name I didn't mention before is Frank Colvett. He is pretty well known across East Memphis and part of the wider portions of the city, but I think he'll need to buy some name ID for the rest if he chooses to go that route. And I think the rest of the candidates have a long way to go too. Michelle McKissick is well known in connected circles who were plugged into the debates about schools, but I think she'll have some ground to cover when it comes to buying name ID across the rest of the city.
And so, in terms of different parts of this city,
right?
Can you help maybe readers? Because I think a lot of politicos, they talk about boxes. They talk about regions, and boxes is a word for precincts here. But going back to 2015,
right,
when it was not a wide open race, there was an incumbent. A.C. Wharton was on the ballot,
right,
but not many people expected Mayor Strickland to beat him.
A challenger was not expected.
Yeah, a challenger was not expected. What who is the Strickland, I guess, of this year? And someone that could maybe win a crowded race.
I think that one thing that makes this race different is that there's not one. Sort of it's relatively well known that your consistent voters tend to be whiter and wealthier. They're very plugged in into the news, plugged into certain communities, and this sort of City Council District 5, we'll call it, which stretches from Midtown all the way to the edge of the Loop. Sort of collects Berkeley, Sea Isle, some disparate parts in like a little triangle. I don't know that there is a candidate that's really going to collect that core vote. That was essential to Strickland's 2015 win, even so much that he didn't even have room to improve a lot with those voters in 2019 because he had already gotten so many of them. I don't know that there's a candidate who I can see right now that would appeal to that sort of base, that would give him money. I ran some stats actually about the 2015 and 2019 race, and who that voted in each of those is actually still on the voter rolls now. So there was about 100,000 people that voted in 2015. 95,000 that voted in 2019. So not in the grand scheme of a citywide race, not a lot of drop off. But there are 23,000 voters from 2015 who are no longer on the rolls at all. And
these are municipal voters, the ones that were in the Memphis municipal election.
Memphis municipal election in 2015. There are a couple of reasons for that. Some have died, some have moved. And some have been de-annexed, are no longer city voters. So those are some of the reasons. And then there's about 85,000 of the 95,000 people who voted in 2019 who are still on the voter rolls. What's interesting is when you dig down, and we'll use city council districts, at least the ones that are on the books in 2022, to kind of analyze neighborhoods. There are about 11,000 core voters in that District 5 out of the 85,000 still on the books that voted in both elections, who are nearly guaranteed to vote in 2023. The same is actually the case for District 6, which covers Whitehaven, South Memphis, and parts of, southern parts of downtown, including probably this building.
And parts of Midtown.
And parts of Midtown. Small sliver of Midtown on the western side. So that district is a heavy voting population that voted in both 15 and 19.
What are the demos largely of that?
So that District 5 is majority white. And so there's, just to give you a raw number, that's the white citizen voting age population of District 5 is 44,000 people. And about 75% of that population is registered to vote. And a slightly smaller percentage of that population ended up voting in the municipal race. District 6 is a majority black district. It has about the same number of active voters, so both have 54,000. And both had about 15,000 people that voted in 2019 that could potentially vote in 2023.
What's their age? What are they? Mostly women?
They are mostly women. Women outvote men in every election, every single time. Since the 20s, effectively, 1920s, that is. And so they're majority women, but they skew very old. So these are folks who would have been in their. I think the median voter, you would say, is a 65-year-old Black woman in District 6 and probably a 65-year-old white woman in District 5, sort of those two core centers of the city voting populace. Memphis voters have always skewed very old. Interestingly, though, 8 years ago, these people would have been, so this does shift through time, right? So these people would have been 8 years younger when they voted in 2015, but I would say this electorate is going to be very much older than you might expect.
And so what are the messages that are going to work to reach those voters?
Right.
What do they want to hear from a mayoral candidate?
I think that both of those groups of voters, but pretty much the city at large is going to be wanting to hear about solutions for crime. This cycle, that's going to be a more pertinent issue than it was in 2019 and 2015. But what to do with youth who aren't attending school, who might be out committing crimes, and what to do about violent crime, what to do about automobile crime. It's interesting. I think a lot of people get really tuned into automobile and property crime this cycle because that's an increasingly expensive portion of their lifestyles. Housing and transportation. And so the things that hit you at home literally are what the messages that are going to get out to people.
And so if you were a candidate today, essentially, I guess I'll ask more specifically then, how does someone beat Willie Harrington or Floyd Bonner given their advantages in name ID?
Right.
And given, you were involved in the race in 2019, Willie Harrington's relative strength against a much better funded incumbent.
Right. I think one of the things that really makes the difference is, at least in 2019, was running on results. We were just talking about it as I was walking up to the studio. It's nice to see cranes in the sky here in Memphis for the first time in a long time. And I think in 2019, right before the pandemic, the mayor was able to sort of make that case. Look at all the new construction that's going on. Interestingly, Willie Harrington probably can make that case too, but he's been very far removed from that time period. Hasn't been in office since the late 2000s. But a lot of people who are still here remember the cranes in the sky from the late 90s.
I remember the Grizzlies coming.
And a lot of big companies moved to Memphis in the 80s, late 80s, and into the early 90s. And so I think, it remains to be seen if he's going to use that as part of his campaign. I think people are looking for more recent results than that. So I think that that's something that a lot of these other candidates are going to have to do. What did you deliver for your city council district or your county commission district? What did you deliver for your state house district? What did you deliver for the school board? Or how have you improved the sheriff's department? I think those are all things that these candidates are going to have to do in order to sort of prove to voters that they have what it takes to run the city.
And so what other geographies should a campaign be aware of and be counting on? Because,
right.
Help me and correct me if I'm misstating this, but if in this upcoming race, if we're looking at a precinct level and all the votes are counted at the end of the day, it's not going to be necessarily that one candidate won a precinct. It's going to be that they did the best at that precinct.
Right. And we'll give some folks some background here. To win the Memphis mayoral race, you don't need to get a majority. There's no runoff. You just simply have to get a plurality, which could mean, in theory, you could win the Memphis mayoral race in this environment with 20-something% of the vote, which is pretty wild, but it's possible. On a precinct-by-precinct basis, winning a plurality is evidence that you have a stronghold in that particular area. So in the 2015 race, you sort of saw big splotches. A.C. Wharton kind of got some of North Memphis, South Memphis. Harold Collins really got some of the, Whitehaven all the way out towards Southwind, sort of the district that he represented on the south side of the city.
District 3, yeah.
Right, District 3. But Mike Williams, interestingly enough, who I think came in fourth in that race and got a sizable portion of the vote, 15-16%, he didn't have a discernible sort of base. He got around that in most precincts across the city, which isn't really how this is going to be won. You have to rack up margins, so more votes than other people in these certain precincts. So the mayor in 2015 and 2019 was able to basically collect a lot of extra votes from those precincts that he won, or in other words, got a plurality at least in. There were really only three major candidates in 2019, so effectively at that rate only a two-man horse race, and so if you did win a precinct, you really got a majority of the vote there. This time, I would be surprised if any candidate was able to achieve a majority in many singular precincts just because of the sheer number of people on the ballot, unless somebody was kind of to become, come from behind the fold into the forefront and really get a grasp on a specific neighborhood. I took the liberty looking at this last night, and we do happen to have, and we use the city council districts as sort of a barometer for this, but we do happen to have a candidate that lives in each city council district, and many with multiple. I thought that was kind of surprising to me because in theory, it sounded to me like there was a big void right in the center of the loop that didn't have many candidates, but there happens to be somebody in each of them. Whether or not they can sort of, grab that ground is a different story. And I think the residency question is kind of interesting too, because
does it matter?
I don't think the residency question matters, but it might matter indirectly in that if you haven't established yourself in one of these areas, then you're not going to collect the votes from around your house. And I think that might be important, but I don't think it was ever going to kick people off the ballot.
Right. And so let me ask you about that, because I think a lot of people, I'm in the media, right? I'm a part of the chattering class. I hope people enjoy me saying that. And people really acted like that was a major issue. And it was obviously a major court issue. It was before a judge. We're not disputing that. But how much do you think that trickled down to these 85,000 people we're talking about?
I'm not sure that it trickled down too much, and I'm pretty firm on that stance because I think that the city of Memphis is such a wide, vast area. There are people who live in an unincorporated county that probably don't even know they don't live in the city of Memphis until they look at their property taxes, and so I'm not convinced that that's going to be an issue, or that's going to be the issue that sinks those candidates under consideration. I don't imagine that that's going to be a real problem for voters at large. Willie Harrington, for example, he was under consideration, for this issue, but he has universal name recognition citywide. And I'm not sure that voters are too concerned about an issue that me and you were probably very plugged into while it was going on.
And so in terms of making it an issue,
right?
Do you think that if a candidate had enough money, for example, and could, run sort of attack ads about the issue on TV, would that matter? Or do you think it might even backfire a little bit because voters may not even care that much at all still?
I think it might backfire because every dollar you spend trying to attack somebody else is a dollar you took away from proving your case to voters. I think that running a positive race in a municipal election is probably the one that's going to do the best. So every dollar that takes away from that message, I think it would probably backfire indirectly. I don't think that voters. I don't think it's a message that appeals to a wide enough group of people to make or break this race, especially considering you'd have to go through a couple of different people if you wanted to do that. If it was only one major candidate that had this residency issue and you really wanted to go in on that, that's easier than the 4 or 5 that were really sort of wrapped up in this.
Sure. And so what should we take away? And these are different races. The city of Memphis race is a nonpartisan race.
Right.
And there's really, most of the people on the ballot identify as Democrats. Frank Colvett has been a long-time Republican committee man in Tennessee.
Right.
But what should we take away from maybe last year's DA race in terms of Amy Wyrick versus Steve Mulroy? And what should that tell us about what happens this year?
Yeah, one thing I'll point out, and I did look at this last night, you can make the case that about 20% of Memphis voters are Republicans. So that's like, taking a composite of all the races since 2016, you can say about 20% of Memphis voters are Republicans, meaning, 3/4 or more are Democrats.
Or independent, yeah.
Or independent. Very small amount of independents within the city of Memphis, less than you would expect. However, I think one thing that you can learn from that race is that in a vacuum, it was a lot closer than you would have expected because on the countywide level, you're looking at a place that voted 2/3 for President Biden and nearly 2/3 for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And to be operating in a world where split ticket voting really died sometime between then and 2022, it's a lot closer than you might have expected. An 11-point loss for a Republican is still a 20-point shift away from what you would consider the partisan baseline. I think what happened in that race that probably has some wider implications is that white candidates, Republican candidates, have really dropped the ball when it comes to their ability to getting sort of, we'll call it black crossover votes. So going into these upper middle class black neighborhoods and their ability to get crossover votes. That's really what sank the Wyrick campaign in 2022.
Is that the candidates dropping the ball, and they may have, or is it maybe a backlash to the unpopularity of the 45th president?
Right. I think that's a lot of it. There's a reason that split ticket voting effectively died at a lot of local levels in 2016, and so I think candidates have really had to overcome that hurdle, particularly Republicans at the local level, in order to achieve electoral success. One thing we talked about not too long ago was that Bill Lee actually was relatively successful in getting black votes in the November election. And in fact, he did better on a margin basis than General Wyrick did just a couple of months before. But I think that he targeted a lot of that message. It wasn't enough to win Shelby County, but again, that wasn't his goal. His goal was expanding his margin from 2018 in a statewide race. So you're not drilling into specific issues that black voters in Memphis might actually be in tune with. You're sort of playing that same game, but with Chattanooga, Nashville, and Knoxville in the mix too.
And we have seen, correct me if I'm wrong, we have seen some local Republicans pull well ahead of President Trump, right? Like
Absolutely.
Mark White, for example, did a lot better on a precinct basis than President Trump did,
right? In fact, Tom Leatherwood did not have an opponent in the general election, but Kevin Vaughn, Mark White, and John Gillespie all performed much better than President Trump did. Mind you, all three Perry Strategies clients.
And for disclosure, your family's firm is not working on any mayoral campaign at this
No
time,
mayoral
right?
or city council races at the moment.
And so what would you like to add, sir? What haven't we covered?
I think that we have not really covered some of the demographic nature of this race. Memphis has diversified a lot over the last 20 years, and certainly a lot since Willie Harrington was elected in 1991. At that point in time, the city was majority white. Mind you, the boundaries were a lot different. But even controlling for that, the city was majority white in 1991 and until 1995. The county was majority white until 2006. But since then, there's been some changes under the hood, but not a lot at the grand level. So it's a lot of folks moving around, moving to different parts of the city, but on the city level, demographics have not changed too much in the last 10 years. But you have some new folks here that these candidates are having to appeal to. I think you've seen sort of a resurgence here where we are downtown in sort of the young professional class and in Midtown. And you've seen a little bit of that go away from East Memphis and out towards, closer to Germantown. I think those folks are kind of getting drawn back further into the city, whether that's for work or entertainment. But that's something that's really changed the game. They don't live in traditional single-family households. And so sending mail may not be the best way to reach those folks, or putting up yard signs. Maybe they don't even pass them on their way to work. That's really, I think, changed the game. And it's all these sort of underlying demographic shifts that are changing that.
How would you combat that? If you can't reach them with yard signs, mail isn't going to work. Is it TV? Is it social? Is it text message?
I think text messages do have a 100% read rate, but it is difficult to track numbers down if you don't already have an existing database. Where that becomes different is if you are somebody who's plugged into a lot of different social circles, and in Memphis, that effectively means churches. You have that contact information. So that's one other thing that makes campaigning in Memphis a lot different, is that when I mean this is all, campaigning is very informal here, that's really getting plugged into churches. Almost everybody is a member of one. And so being a member would grant you access to that contact information. And if you have that sort of network, or someone who's willing to give you a directory for another group that they want you to speak to, that's how you reach those people. You get their personal contact information, or you find a way to target them via social, or maybe you figure out where they work or where they are entertained. That might be at the breweries, or it could be, having an event after work near something that might attract a young professional. But I'll put a caveat on that and say, as interesting as this all might seem, and I certainly fall into this category of person too, we have not seen this group show up to vote. And even when they do, they still make up a very small portion of the electorate. Think about the city of Memphis like a giant bathtub where the water is ice cold. And maybe there's water trickling in from one side that's scalding hot, but it's going to take a lot of that scalding hot water that's dripping to change the temperature of the bathtub. So I'm not convinced that in a city as large as this and a race as large as this, with an electorate that's relatively predictable as far as demographics are concerned, that the sort of core voters that I might even consider myself part of are going to change the game. I think you'd be better off targeting folks in traditional media. And one other thing too, and sorry if I'm talking too long, but we have not discussed door knocking in 2015 and 2019. And maybe if you have I
want to go there, because Mayor Strickland was really good at door knocking.
Yes,
and he knocked on a lot of doors.
Right.
Should someone just door knock the whole race? Is that going to work?
I think that's a pretty good way to garner name recognition within significant pockets of the city, for folks that might be at home, or folks that might be receptive to somebody taking the personal time to do it. I think what made Mayor Strickland very different than some of the candidates who are on board today is, like I said, an excellent retail politician, and he would knock doors all day and every day after work, if given the opportunity. My question for the 2023 candidates is that going to be as well received as it was 4 years ago? There's a perception that the city is a lot less safe. And maybe that's because of COVID, or that's because of perceptions about crime. And so maybe they would look less fondly upon a candidate that takes the time to come straight to their door than they would, say, try to get to them through some other form of media.
And so should a candidate abandon door knocking?
I wouldn't think so. With access to the voter rolls and access to all this information, we do know, or campaigns should know, if they don't, who is going to vote and where they live. A lot of the voters who own a home or rent a home and have sort of that stake, have a piece of land within the city that they care about. They're tuned in to the politics and knocking on their door and saying, here's my plan to help the city. That multiplies, right? You might not go to the neighbor's house because they've not voted before, but if that neighbor who did see you in person calls their friend or texts their friend and say, hey, this candidate just knocked on my door, that speaks volumes. I know that when we met in 2019, there were people coming out of their houses because they found out that the mayor was there. The sort of network of Ring doorbells just sort of clicked, and everybody found out. We were near Haven View Middle, and sort of everybody figured out that the mayor was there and wanted to come out and talk to him about their respective issues.
He was sweating.
Yeah, it was a long, hot day in the middle of the summer. That being said, I think that door knocking is and has always been very effective. And even if you don't contact somebody at their door and speak to them, which can be a time-consuming activity, these sort of literature drops, hanging something on the doorknob or on their mailbox, if you know that those are, the voters that you're looking for, that's a good way to get name ID too. Direct mail and literature drops have always been important in Memphis.
And so if you were allocating resources for a campaign in terms of spend, give me the pie breakdown for what you think could be a successful campaign this year, like X in traditional media, X in literature, X in direct mail.
I won't give all the secrets because I'll say that people typically pay Perry Strategies for that information. But I would say that traditional media, getting on Channel 3 and Channel 5 is a really incredibly important first step for name ID. And like I said, I think $250,000. There are a handful of candidates that have that in the bank. We'll see what they have June 30th. That amount of money is the bare minimum to get on television, and that's for production and buying the airtime. Radio is a lot cheaper than that, but I think if you're not going to go the route of cable television, then spending a lot of that portion of that pie, I don't have a good breakdown of percentages for you, but spending some portion of that pie, if you can't afford television, is going to be radio. A lot of wide-reaching stations here in Memphis.
And so to put a pin on this conversation, which has been illuminating, and I think people should listen to and learn a lot from, is if you're going to give me a prediction today, I'm not going to ask you for a candidate.
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask you for a percentage of the vote. How close is the race? How many percentage points apart are the two leading candidates?
Right.
And what percentage of the vote does the winner have?
So I like to say I'm not in the business of predictions. I'm in the business of forecasts. So I can tell you who is more likely to achieve something than somebody else.
All right, Nate Silver, hit me.
I think that I would say that some of the leading candidates right now, Paul Young, Floyd Bonner, Willie Harrington, I think those three are sort of fighting over large pieces of the pie. I think the winner of this race could probably defeat the second closest person by 5-6 points. It's going to be close because there are a lot of well-known candidates in this race that I think are going to collect somewhere between 10 and 15%, which leaves sort of a limited pool for the rest. To give people some background, Mayor Strickland was able to command 43% of the vote in 2019, close to 60% or more than 60% of the vote in 2019.
You said 15.
Sorry,
yeah.
15 was 43%, 19 is 60. That's kind of unheard of. I think 60%, that's not going to happen this time. Even 43% is a pretty high lift for some folks that haven't already served the city in some capacity. I would say that one example of a race, so we go back to 2007, 2011, I think the last race that Willie Harrington ran in, which was 2007, he won by a little under 10 points. He got the same margin as Strickland in 15, like 40-something percent. He beat the next closest person, who at the time was Carol Chumney, by 9 or 10 points. I would say that might be a heavy lift this time around, though that was a race where you had 2 or 3 big ticket, big name ID candidates, including an incumbent mayor. This time around, you have a lot of people, some of whom are relatively unknown, but have proven that they have the monetary capacity to run a decent campaign in a vacuum. I think you could see somebody win this race by just a few points.
And you mentioned that monetary capacity. You mentioned Paul Young in there. And Paul Young, you also said, is someone that's got to build name ID and buy name ID. But you think that he has, to this point, built enough financial capacity that he's going to be able to buy it?
I think we'll have to see after June 30th, because the dynamics of this race have immediately changed after the residency question was solved. And after we sort of figured out who the slate of candidates would be, petitions, having come out, I think he has proven he has the ability to raise some money, but those folks have, you can still donate to somebody else, even if you donated to one candidate, right? So if they choose to go another direction, there's at least one candidate that has the ability to self-fund. That's J.W. Gibson. He, interestingly, also comes from or lives in an area of the city that's not that doesn't typically bring people to the
Where
table.
Is that?
So he lives in District 1, which is effectively Raleigh and North Cordova. So he lives in the Raleigh portion of that district. That's interesting to me. I think you haven't seen a lot of people from Raleigh, which is historically not brought a lot of voters out. In fact, I was looking at this today, and really about half the number of people that voted in both elections in East Memphis and in Whitehaven voted in that.
So 6,000-7,000.
Yeah, 5,600 people voted in both races in that district. A lot of that is because there's been a lot of movement, a lot of transient voters. But back to my original point, he's somebody that both has the ability to self-fund and comes from an area of the city that maybe hasn't turned out to vote because they don't feel like somebody from their neighborhood has really represented them on the stage citywide. Raising money is only half of it. Spending it wisely is the other half. Being careful about the vendors that you use and so forth is going to be much more important than just raising the money. You could raise $500,000 and only spend it in one place, and it doesn't do you any good.
Let me ask you maybe a controversial question here.
Sure.
And there's the and I think it's fair to call it the pay-to-play ballot system, which are essentially flyers that poll workers during early voting and election day are handing out, and it's so-and-so's ballot. It's a list of endorsements.
Right.
The mayor was featured prominently on several of those ballots, and his campaign finance filings show that he donated a significant amount of money getting on those ballots. What impact do you think those will have this time around? And is that money that candidates need to spend?
I think, again, like I said, mail is getting a lot more expensive. And so those we call them ballot guys, those ballot guys who did sort of operate within the last 10 years, that stuff is getting a lot more expensive, and printing is gotten a lot more expensive too. And again, those ballots are only as good as the lists that they're distributed to or the polling places to which they're handed out. We haven't seen a lot of those ballot guys pop up yet, but they will. And I think some of the candidates are going to learn very quickly that in order to get into some of these sort of communities that are not reachable by anything other than mail, if they are reachable by TV, they'll probably learn the hard way that you have to fork over some money to get on some of these ballots. But there's another complicating factor to that too. There are so many mayoral candidates on the ballot, and they might just simply put on the ballot the person who's the highest bidder. And they may not want to be on that ballot next to some of the other candidates who are running for city council. So there are a lot of different moving pieces, a lot of plates to spin when it comes to these ballots. I think, but some of these candidates may learn the hard way that you can't get around them sometimes. So I don't, there are many of them that will probably be circulating this election, and in addition to traditional media, I'm sure spending some money on those will help some of those candidates.
So again, I'll ask you one more time. What would you like to add? Because I've really learned a lot and appreciate the time.
I think we talked about this a little bit. I put on my urban planning hat a lot of times to think about the city of Memphis. It's a place that's really, not only is it my home, but it's really interesting to me because it's been on what I'll call sort of a failed experiment for a long time. And that's, the city has maintained the same population, but doubled in size. And so the job of the mayor in this day and age is effectively dealing with the consequences of that. Policing is a lot more expensive. Emergency services are a lot more expensive. You have double the sewer system, double the roadways, and it becomes expensive for individuals to live in the city. It's the job of the mayor in this day and age, and I think Mayor Strickland really understood this when he wanted to get back to the basics, but the job of this mayor going forth, and anyone who wants to run for office in the city of Memphis, is understanding that and sort of helping manage the consequences of a decision made over many decades within the city of Memphis.
And that decision, to be more explicit for people, is the decision to really grow by annexation.
Yes, correct.
And to add essentially a population that was leaving, to just add them back by just annexing where they lived.
Right. So, previously in the state of Tennessee, there was no, in order to be annexed, there was no referendum. You didn't get any vote. I don't think there was even any notice when you bought property within the unincorporated county that you could be annexed. Mind you, this isn't a problem. Some people are happy to be annexed by the municipalities outside the city, but right. So in the 60s, Whitehaven was the famous example. In the early 80s, you had South Cordova. In the late 90s, you had Hickory Hill. Right. A lot of these areas of 50, 60 to 100,000 people that the city has sort of, served as the Borg, absorbed, taken their infrastructure, for lack of a better term, and then has to deal with the consequences of financing, maintaining, and servicing all that. And that's an incredibly difficult challenge that a lot of municipal mayors deal with, but particularly in Memphis, which is so massive and diverse. And so you have clashing interests and all kinds of things that make that problem very difficult to solve. And now all these communities are incorporated within the city, and so they feel that they're citizens of Memphis. A lot of this has been sort of settled for a long time, and so all that infrastructure, all the issues that arise from having a city that large, are now upon the mayor to sort of orchestrate a solution to.
Well, this has been, like I said before, a great conversation and really eye-opening for me, and I hope our listeners enjoy it. Cole, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Sam, and I hope I can come back soon.
Absolutely. This is Sam Hardiman. You've been listening to On the Record podcast, and my guest today was Cole Perry of Perry Strategies. Please be sure to check out all of the Daily Memphian's other podcasts, including Behind the Headlines, Sound Bites, and our Grizzlies podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. You can find my work and the work of those of my colleagues at dailymemphian.com.
In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.